Good morning and welcome. This is Business Morning. Thank you for joining us. I'm Chimeze Obi-Iwagu. Let's get the show started on the global oil market as prices extended gains in early trade amid signs that producers are cutting production to cope with a collapse in demand for fuel as the coronavirus outbreak ravages the world's economies. Brent crude was up 33 cents at $20.70 a barrel after rising more than 5% on Wednesday. West Texas Intermediate futures were up 28 cents at $14.06 a barrel, having risen around a fifth in the previous session. U.S. crude futures fell to below minus $40 on Monday on concerns that buyers were running out of storage space to take deliveries. In the United States, the world's biggest oil producer, Oklahoma's energy regulator, said companies could shut wells without losing their leases, an initial victory for struggling U.S. producers seeking relief from the market crash after a surge in production. The state is the fourth largest oil producer in the U.S. As oil consumption collapses, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, Russia, and other producers, a group known as OPEC+, are set to cut supply by a record 9.7 million barrels per day from May 1. Analysts say those cuts may have to be extended to match the shortfall in demand. The coronavirus sweeping across the world has infected more than 2.5 million people and killed nearly 180,000 people, forcing governments to impose strict lockdowns and shutter industries while pushing central banks to unleash unparalleled stimulus. Oh, there is no doubt the global economy is passing through an unprecedented time as the COVID-19 ravages the economy, with death toll still mounting, particularly in the developed West. However, many believe the pandemic's impact on Africa could be much worse. African and international leaders have been called upon to act boldly, decisively, and immediately to prevent a catastrophe. While measures such as social distancing is being taken, one person who believes that though social distancing can slow the spread of the virus but will not win the war except finding a vaccine is Nigeria's former finance minister and a member of IMF's External Advisory Group on COVID-19, Dr. Okonjo-Iweala, and she joins us now. Thank you, Dr. Okonjo-Iweala, for joining us on the show.
Thank you, Chimeze.
Now, a world divided by hope and fear, would that be an appropriate description for the global economy, and Africa in particular, at this time?
Yes, it's a very unprecedented time in the world now. There's a lot of fear because nobody actually quite understands or knows what this virus will do. So it's like a discovery as people go along. So that brings a lot of uncertainty, a lot of fear, the fact that it can infect people so easily, the fact that people don't know whether once you have it, you're going to be immune or you can have it again. These are all the things that excite the fear. The impact of the pandemic on the economies of the world also brings that type of uncertainty. But there's also the hope that a vaccine will be found in the not too distant future. There has never been such a concentrated attention of scientists all over the world trying to find an appropriate vaccine that can deal with this issue. And I think that's the sustainable solution for the long term that can help the world cope with this. So that gives some hope that in the next 12 to 18 months, perhaps we'll have a vaccine.
Yeah, talking about the vaccine. Yes, over the years, the world has gone through different kinds of crises, financial crisis, economic crisis, and now this is health crisis. And just as you said, the world is currently scrambling to get a vaccine to tackle this health problem. Now, you are advocating a vaccine bond. Why has this become necessary at this time?
Well, one of the reasons I talked about the vaccine bond is because the world is going to need unprecedented amounts of resources in order to fund the work of scientists who are doing this research, the work of manufacturers who are going to manufacture the vaccine, when the work of delivering the vaccine to people all over the world. Once this vaccine is found, it's expected that maybe billions of doses will be needed, depending on the type of vaccine it is and how many people it's delivered to all over the world. That will need a lot of money upfront. And one of the instruments that is available, which Gavi, the Global Alliance, that I'm chair of the board, an instrument it has called the International Finance Facility for Immunization, is capable of being used to go on the capital markets of the world and with the guarantees of supportive governments, it's able to raise money up front and front load that money to those who are working so that they can have it to develop this bond, to develop the vaccine, sorry. The vaccine should be seen as a global public good, meaning that whoever finds it first, they should not hog it to themselves. They should allow it to be used for everybody around the world as a humanitarian gesture. They should allow manufacturers who are capable of manufacturing all over the world to do that so that we can have enough doses for everybody. And this vaccine bond will provide the resources to be able to do all of that, to develop, manufacture, and then deliver all over the world, including to African countries.
I want to believe that this vaccine bond is going to come as a sovereign bond. Now, what is the implications of this for African countries who are already highly indebted?
No, this is not. This vaccine bond would not be for countries to borrow. What I'm talking about is, Gavi, a multilateral organization, would raise the resources using this instrument on the capital markets, and then it would be used to fund developers of the vaccine, manufacturers, and fund the delivery of the vaccine, which is going to be quite expensive. People are estimating billions of dollars to be able to do this work. So this is not for sovereign governments to borrow in order to get the vaccine, no. We are looking at a situation where the world looks at this as a global public good. Everybody contributes, giving their guarantees to raise this money, and then the vaccines are given to governments and to people at very affordable prices. So this does not entail any loan on any part of government.
I mean, the African Development Bank recently issued a $3 billion COVID-19 bond. How is this vaccine bond different from this?
Yeah, the COVID-19 bond, which is also a good instrument, is slightly different. The COVID-19 bond that was raised by the African Development Bank was to make resources available to governments on the continent to be able to access these resources at the ADB's terms. Some will be concessional, from what I understand, meaning very low interest rates, and other resources will be at the normal ADB rates. But what it means is that they are trying to make resources, money available to government so that they can borrow it from the bank and buy equipment and supplies and test kits and all the things that they need to fight COVID-19. That is a very different issue from having the world use the IFIM bond to raise resources to finance a vaccine that will be good for everybody in the world. So one is for sovereign governments to borrow. That is the COVID-19 bond of the ADB. The other one is for a global public good to raise resources to develop and deliver vaccines.
Now, aside from this vaccine bond offer, how can various governments, particularly in Africa, leverage the capital market to tackle the issue of COVID-19?
Well, let me say that, this is a humanitarian crisis and then it's an economic crisis. And a lot of countries are already struggling with considerable debt. So it will be important to tap all the concessional resources available first, where you can get either grants, and there are several organizations that give grants like Gavi, the Global Vaccine Alliance, my organization. You have the Global Fund. They also give grants. Then you have low interest loans from some of the multilaterals, like the African Development Bank, the World Bank, the IMF, and so on. I would tap those sources first before trying to go on any capital markets at this time. I think those sources hopefully should be enough for the health aspect. Now, when it comes to economic recovery, then we begin to look at, okay, what additional sources? There's a concerted move by leaders on the continent backed or who have appointed some of us as envoys, the African Union, to try and see how we can tap resources from all over the world to support the work that Africa is doing, both from the private sector, the public sector, the multilaterals. So what I'm trying to say to you is for this kind of crisis, given that governments are, some of them are struggling with debt all over the continent, as much as one can leverage grants, very, very low interest loans first to deal with the crisis, that will be preferable to going on the capital markets at this time.
Now, governments across the globe are coming up with different measures, stimulus packages and palliatives to cushion the effect of COVID-19. As a member of IMF's External Advisory Group on COVID-19, what's your take on the directions African governments have taken so far?
Yeah, thank you. Actually, the External Advisory Group is not just on COVID-19. It's just an external advisory board for the IMF. But let me come to the question you raised on measures that have been taken. You know that the African countries were hit first by the economic crisis before the health crisis. Once the COVID-19 pandemic started in China and then Europe and then the USA, demand for our products plummeted. Most people produce commodities on the continent. And so this has made a very huge economic impact. So we're already dealing with that before the pandemic really arrived and we started dealing with the health impact. I think that governments on the continent have made a very brave effort to try to do the lockdowns and the social distancing needed. The difficult thing, Chimeze, is that nobody quite knows how to fight this virus. So the only two instruments available right now are this lockdowns and social distancing, trying to keep people from going into crowds, asking them to observe good hygiene, constant hand washing. This is what is available, wearing masks, and so on and so forth. So I think governments have tried to practice that. It's actually quite courageous because when you do lockdowns on our continent, it's very difficult on people because many people earn their living on a daily basis. They have to go out and work to feed their families. So when you say lockdown, it means they can't earn anything. And they are wondering, how are we going to eat today? So you hear people talking of hunger virus killing them before coronavirus. So yes, the measures have been taken, but we need to do more and we need to get additional resources. This virus is a pandemic. It's a global problem. On the economic front, the governments of Africa, on average, have tried to do fiscal stimulus which amounts to about 0.8% of GDP. This is 1/10 of what has been done in the G7 countries. Their own goes from 8 to 10% of GDP, and Japan has even gone as high as 20%. So that means we don't have the fiscal space to be able to do more, meaning we don't have enough resources and revenues. And this is why it's important to try and raise additional resources for the continent outside. As AU envoy, along with 3 other colleagues, we are working really hard to see what types of resources we can raise. Part of it is asking for a debt standstill for 2 years, so countries don't have to pay, so they can use the resources to feed people, to make sure they have money in their pockets to buy the necessary equipment needed.
Right. Now, let's look at the recent debt relief announced by the G20 for the IDA countries. Is that enough to address the current economic situation, particularly for African countries?
The G20 has opened the door by saying that they would observe a standstill till the end of the year, 9 months or so. And this is good. It's an opening. We welcome that. But we believe that this is not enough. They have to go further. And we're asking for an across-the-board standstill for 2 years for all African countries, not just low-income countries, as they have indicated. We want it to be all countries. Because, you know, what we call the neighborhood effect. If you say that some middle-income countries, let's take South Africa, should not be looked at and they should not benefit. South Africa is very important to all the surrounding countries around it. They depend on South Africa's economy to also stimulate their own economy. So the same with Nigeria in West Africa. If Nigeria doesn't do well, it impacts all the other countries. So we'd like the entire continent to be considered for a standstill. And that's what we're pushing for. We're saying what they've done now is good, but it's not enough.
Now, but how many of these African countries, is actually qualified for a debt relief?
Well, first, what we're saying is debt standstill. Debt standstill means let us halt payment of interest and principal for 2 years, just to release resources for countries to be able to take care of emergency measures. Instead of waiting for disbursement from somewhere, if you already have the resources you are going to use to pay for debt service, if they say don't pay interest and principal for a year or two, you will have those resources immediately available to you to be able to strengthen safety nets, take care of poor people at the end of the spectrum who are looking for resources to eat, buy the necessary medical equipment. We estimate that if you have a standstill for the continent, it will amount to about $44 billion per year. And this is quite a substantial sum that will be needed. So during this 2 year standstill, you can now look at the issue of, okay, which countries need debt restructuring, which ones need debt relief. The IMF already and the G20, as you said, have already agreed that the low-income countries will be able to get debt relief. The IMF has gone and announced 25 countries, 19 of them African countries, are going to get this debt relief. So during the 2 years, we will look at this issue and say, who qualifies for what kind of treatment? That will give us enough time to solve those issues.
Now, what are the typical conditions that a developing country will have to fulfill to be eligible for concessionary funding and soft terms from the multilateral agencies like the World Bank and the IMF and, of course, AFDB?
Well, for the issue of the fighting COVID-19 and trying to get emergency medical equipment and other needed things and trying to shore up the economy, I believe that many of the institutions right now are trying not to talk of the issue of conditionality. They're simply trying to get the resources disbursed quickly to countries so that they can deal with what is a humanitarian crisis. And on this continent, if we don't mobilize resources quickly, you can have a situation where you have a health crisis, an economic crisis, and maybe even a food crisis. Because you should remember, the people need food, need to be fed. So we have to make sure that our agriculture is working on the continent. So we don't have three types of crisis. So right now, I do not think there's an issue of conditionality. The institutions are simply trying to get money into the hands of countries so they can act. When it comes to the issue of debt relief, that's another set of issues which we just right now are not focusing on the issues of conditionality until we get past the crisis. During the 2 year standstill, you can now discuss what is needed to assist countries, both with bilateral debt, multilateral, and even commercial and private debt. What types of vehicles do you need? Some countries do not want to be seen as not being able to pay their commercial debt in particular because they want to continue to have access to the capital markets after. So what do you devise as an instrument so that the ratings agencies and the capital markets do not see these countries as going into default? These are all the things that we're looking at right now as a way of helping countries weather this crisis.
All right, Doctor, just hold your thoughts there. We'll get back to you. We'll take a quick break. When we come back, Dr. Okonjo-Iweala will still be with us. Just stay with us. Welcome back. If you've just joined us, you're watching Business Morning on Channels Television, and we still have with us Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, Nigeria's former finance minister and a member of IMF's External Advisory Group. Thank you, Dr. Okonjo-Iweala, for sticking on with us.
Thank you, Chimeze.
Now, the price of oil has dropped by over 60% since 2019, and I know that you have always advocated for commodity-dependent countries to save for the rainy days. Now, what must African countries dependent on commodities such as oil do now to salvage the situation? What structural changes must they make to alter the trajectory for the future?
Well, Chimeze, this is a really difficult situation now, and you said that I've always advocated saving during the time when commodity prices are good, and that is the truth. You have to create what economists call buffers. During the time that prices are good, you save and you keep it so that when prices are down or bad, you have those savings to draw on. And this is what many, many countries do. And that's what we're trying to advocate and still advocate all over the continent where you have countries dependent on commodities. If you look even in the Middle East, you'll see that countries there, be it UAE, Kuwait, you've got Norway, you've got so many countries that have commodity dependent. They save and save and save because what goes up must come down. So you have to anticipate the day when the commodity prices, whether it's oil, whether it's industrial metals, which some of our countries on the continent export, whether it's even agricultural exports, when they come down. So that is the reason. And it's important to learn that lesson because this is not going to stop. There'll be business cycles, there'll be cycles with commodity prices. So what you also need to do is to make the economy less dependent on these commodities. And that is why, for the longer term, restructuring the economy so that you can also have other sources that can create jobs for people, other sources where you can tap revenues. Part of the issue, let's take Nigeria or some other African countries. Our economies have a lot of sectors that are quite diverse. We've got agriculture, we've got tourism, we've got creative industries. I think learning how to tax some of these other sectors better, manufacturing, you have to look all across the board and say, are we getting enough resources from this sector? So it's not just diversifying your economy, you also have to diversify your sources of revenue, meaning you have to tax better. So this is what our countries need to look at now and start planning about how they're going to do better at this in the future.
Now, if there is a deep global recession this time as projected by the IMF, what would African countries as a group do?
Well, for now, you're absolutely right. The IMF has projected that the world is going to contract by 3% this year, African countries by about 1.8%. So that's a very, very tough contraction for all the countries. So you have to look, what can we do within us? What can we get together on our own? And then what do we need to go outside and get, and on what terms? So you have to look at both internal and external resources. Of course, when the economy is contracting, the amount of internal resources you're able to garner will be much more limited. So you have to look for external resources to help complement. And that's what a lot of countries are looking at now. But they're looking for it because you don't want countries to stack up more debt, which they cannot pay. Countries are looking for very low interest rate, very concessional resources, grants. And there are organizations, like I said, that are willing to give countries grants. I mentioned Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, the Global Fund, very low interest rate resources, and some grants are available from the IMF and the World Bank. I think that countries need to tap the multilaterals, the same with the African Development Bank, and make sure they don't go to sources that are going to result in higher debt. Because you remember I talked about fiscal space. Countries don't have the room to be servicing more debt, so they need to get very, very, very concessional resources.
All right, let's look at China now. China just reported negative growth of minus 6.8%. Looking at the fact that China is so much connected to Africa, what would the spillover effect be like for Africa as a whole, particularly with the Belt and Road Initiative?
You know, Chimezie, this is a serious problem. I think they are projecting for the past quarter severe contraction, and maybe by the end of the year, very, very low growth. And China is a huge market for the rest of the world. It's also a huge manufacturing hub for the rest of the world. So when China goes into this kind of slowdown, it's going to have, as you say, very difficult and negative spillover effects on the rest of the world, because China demands a lot of goods, a lot of commodities. And if that demand is not there, that means that the market to sell is not there. You can see that with oil. I heard a clip from your news item talking about the glut on the oil market. We talked about the fact that the price has plunged. This is because China's demand is down from China. Now you have the Belt and Road and other initiatives. Well, you know, we have to wait and see how the Chinese government deals with this. But obviously, with the economy in slowing down and contracting, people have to think, how are they going to be able to continue to garner the resources to sustain these projects? Let us see what choices they'll make and what they'll do. But I think you can expect somewhat difficult times ahead.
Light of these bleak economic outlook, do you see light at the end of the tunnel?
Well, we must always maintain hope. As long as we're alive and we have our brains, there's hope. So I think this will be a difficult year, 2020, spilling over into 2021. But my belief is that if the world acts as one together, if countries do not retreat into nationalism and populism, looking out for themselves only, the world does have the resources to be able to deal with this issue and to be able to help countries that don't have enough. During the 2008-2009 financial crisis, it was a very tough time for all countries, but the world came together. And those countries that needed support got the support. Resources were mobilized at that time by then Prime Minister Gordon Brown. I feel this is a time for the world to come together. So I'm not so pessimistic. I think some of this will happen and there'll be some light at the end of that tunnel. We've got to keep on hoping. That's why we're human. We cannot descend into pessimism. Otherwise, we'll be completely paralyzed and we won't act.
Absolutely, we'll keep the hope alive. Thank you so much, Dr. Okonjo-Iweala, for your time. Do have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you, Chimezie. You too.